The Caves Legends of Florence. Imagine a prison so secure that even the world's most feared men vanish inside it. Men who once ruled countries, destroyed cities, and terrified millions. Inside ADX Florence, also called Alcatraz of the Rockies, steel doors slam shut on terrorists, cartel bosses, and killers who can never walk free again. Picture this. A man who once controlled billions in drug money now sits alone in a 7 by 12-foot cell for 23 hours a day, talking only to the walls. Another, the mastermind of the 9/11 attacks, is locked away where even sunlight struggles to touch him. And deep within those concrete walls, prisoners who once commanded armies now spend years without hearing another human voice. But here's the shocking truth. ADX Florence was not built just to lock men up. It was built to break them. And the list of prisoners here reads like a nightmare. So the question is, how did these men, cartel kings, terrorists, and serial killers, end up inside America's most secure prison? The cartel king who dug tunnels. The first name on this list needs no introduction, Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán. For decades, El Chapo was the most powerful drug lord on earth, controlling the Sinaloa cartel. His empire moved more cocaine, heroin, and meth than any other in history. He became legendary not just for his power, but for his escapes. In 2001, he slipped out of Mexican prison in a laundry cart. In 2015, he shocked the world again, escaping through a mile-long underground tunnel dug right into a shower. When the U.S. finally extradited him in 2017, there was no debate where he was going. El Chapo was locked inside ADX Florence. Today, he spends nearly every hour alone in a concrete box, with no tunnels, no laundry carts, just silence. But El Chapo isn't the only global kingpin trapped in the Rockies. The terrorist masterminds. ADX Florence also holds some of the deadliest terrorists in modern history. Take Ramzi Yousef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. He planted a truck filled with explosives beneath the North Tower, hoping to topple it. The blast killed 6 people and injured over 1,000. When FBI agents finally caught him in 1995, he was flown straight to the U.S. under armed guard. At ADX Florence, Yousef spends his days in special administrative measures, meaning even his letters and phone calls are monitored word by word. He is one of the prisoners America can never risk giving freedom again. And then there's Zacarias Moussaoui, once called the 20th hijacker of 9/11. He trained with Al-Qaeda and admitted he was supposed to be part of the attacks. Convicted in 2006, he now lives under the same crushing silence as Yousef. But ADX isn't just home to terrorists and drug lords. Some of its most dangerous residents are American-born killers. The Unabomber silence. Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber, waged a war against modern society by sending bombs through the mail. From 1978 to 1995, his homemade explosives killed 3 and injured 23 more. He hid in a tiny Montana cabin, scribbling his manifesto about technology and control. When he was captured in 1996, the world finally saw the face of the man who had eluded the FBI for almost 2 decades. ADX Florence became his permanent home. For years, Kaczynski lived in solitary, his brilliant mind now trapped behind concrete and bars. Prison officials said he rarely spoke, spending hours reading or writing alone in his cell. And yet, for all his silence, he wasn't the only intellectual locked inside ADX. Another inmate was a man who once leaked the most sensitive secrets of America itself, the spy who betrayed America. Robert Hanssen. The name still haunts the FBI. Hanssen was an FBI agent himself, but for more than 20 years, he sold America's deepest secrets to Russia. He betrayed double agents, exposed nuclear plans, and handed Moscow information that put countless lives at risk. When the FBI finally caught him in 2001, the betrayal was so severe that Attorney General John Ashcroft called it the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history. Hanssen was sentenced to life without parole and immediately shipped to ADX Florence. There, the man who once moved in the shadows of espionage now lives under constant surveillance. Every word, every move recorded. But espionage wasn't the darkest crime represented in ADX, because inside these walls also lived men whose cruelty went beyond anything a spy or terrorist could imagine. The killers who couldn't be tamed. One of the most infamous is Thomas Silverstein, a prison gang leader who murdered 3 inmates and a guard. Known as the most dangerous prisoner in America, he spent decades in solitary confinement. His cell at ADX was specially designed to keep him from ever interacting with another person. And then there's Richard McNair, a master escape artist who once slipped out of handcuffs with lip balm and later mailed himself out of prison in a pallet of mail bags. After years of humiliating prison officials with his escapes, McNair was finally placed at ADX Florence, where escape is impossible. But the list doesn't stop there, because ADX Florence has held serial killers, terrorists, gang leaders, and even men of war. And their stories only get darker from here. The Boston Marathon Bomber. April 15, 2013. A sunny day in Boston turned into chaos. 2 homemade pressure cooker bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 3 people were killed instantly, and more than 260 were injured in one of the worst terror attacks on U.S. soil since 9/11. The mastermind? 2 brothers, Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. Tamerlan was killed during a police shootout. Dzhokhar, only 19 years old at the time, fled and was found hiding in a boat. At his trial in 2015, jurors heard about the nails and ball bearings packed into bombs. The innocent lives shattered in seconds. He was sentenced to death, but while awaiting execution, he was sent to ADX Florence. Inside, Dzhokhar lives in near total silence. His cell is concrete, his window just 4 inches wide, angled so he can only see the sky. For 23 hours a day, he sits alone, no internet, no TV beyond educational programs, no communication except monitored mail. The young man who once roamed free now has a world that measures only 7 steps across. And yet he isn't alone. In the same prison block are men who destroyed nations. The Oklahoma City bomber. On the morning of April 19, 1995, a Ryder truck filled with fertilizer and explosives pulled up in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb exploded. The blast ripped through the building, killing 168 people, including children in a daycare center, and injuring hundreds more. The man behind it was Terry Nichols, working alongside Timothy McVeigh. McVeigh was executed in 2001. Nichols, however, was sentenced to life without parole. Nichols was transferred to ADX Florence, where he spends his years under administrative segregation. Prison reports suggest Nichols avoids other inmates, spending much of his time reading the Bible. But even in ADX, Nichols has complained, at one point suing the government because he didn't like the prison food. Think about that for a moment. A man who killed 168 people, now living out his life in a cell, fighting over bread and beans. That's the contrast of ADX, the most violent criminals reduced to the simplest battles. But Nichols isn't the only one. Another inmate story shows how even the world's most feared mafia bosses end up broken inside these walls. The fall of Whitey Bulger. For decades, James Whitey Bulger ran the streets of Boston. A feared mob boss, he controlled rackets, extortion, and murder. FBI files linked him to at least 11 killings. But what made his story infamous was his secret life as an FBI informant, tipping off the very agency that was supposed to bring him down. When investigators closed in during the mid-1990s, Bulger vanished. For 16 years, he was one of America's most wanted fugitives, finally captured in 2011 in Santa Monica, California, living quietly with his girlfriend. He was convicted in 2013 and sentenced to life. At first, he was sent to several prisons. In 2018, he was transferred to USP Hazleton in West Virginia, and within 24 hours, he was murdered by other inmates. But before that brutal ending, Whitey Bulger had already spent time in ADX Florence. There, stripped of his power, the once feared kingpin of Boston walked in shackles, eating the same bland meals as the men he once ruled over. ADX became his silent cage, his legend shrinking behind concrete. And while Bulger's story ended in blood, some ADX inmates live on with even darker pasts. The Shoe Bomber. December 2001. Just 3 months after September 11th, passengers aboard American Airlines Flight 63 noticed a man bending down, trying to light something in his shoe. That man was Richard Reid. Reid had packed explosives inside his sneakers, planning to blow up the plane over the Atlantic. But as smoke rose from his shoe, passengers and flight attendants tackled him, tying him up with seatbelts and headphone cords. The bomb never detonated. In 2003, Reid was sentenced to life in prison without parole. His destination, ADX Florence. Inside, Reid is placed under special restrictions. He isn't allowed to communicate freely. His mail screened for terrorist connections. Guards call him the shoe bomber. But in ADX, names mean nothing. Here, he is just another man in a box. And yet, he shares that box-like life with another infamous name, a man whose attacks change the skies forever. The 9/11 conspirators. If ADX Florence has a darkest corner, it belongs to the men tied directly to the 9/11 attacks. We already mentioned Zacarias Moussaoui, but alongside him are others tied to al-Qaeda operations. The prison is designed so that these men can never speak to each other, never spread messages, never organize again. Inmates like Moussaoui and Ramzi Yousef are locked under special administrative measures, meaning even their mail is censored, their calls restricted to immediate family, and even those calls are monitored. Prison officials have said these inmates are some of the most closely watched in the country. Their cells are isolated so that sound barely carries. Their exercise yards are cages within cages, open to sky but surrounded by concrete walls. For them, ADX Florence is not just a prison. It is a place where time stands still, where every day is a reminder that their power, their voices, their networks are gone. And yet, for all their infamy, ADX also holds men whose crimes were quieter, but just as devastating. The underwear bomber. Christmas Day, December 25th, 2009. Hundreds of families boarded Northwest Airlines Flight 253, heading to Detroit to celebrate the holidays. But in seat 19, they sat a man carrying a secret that could have killed them all. His name was Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab, a Nigerian student radicalized by al-Qaeda in Yemen. He had sewn explosives into his underwear. His plan was simple: detonate the device as the plane descended, turning it into a fireball of death. But as he tried to ignite it, the device malfunctioned. Passengers saw smoke and flames rising from his lap. Chaos erupted. Brave passengers leapt across the aisle, restraining him as the plane made an emergency landing. In 2012, Abdulmutallab was sentenced to life in prison. His new home? ADX Florence. Inside, Umar lives under the tightest restrictions possible. His letters are censored. His visits are limited to lawyers and immediate family. Prison officials fear he could spread extremist ideology, so his voice is silenced completely. The young man who once wanted to bring down a plane full of families now spends his life trapped in a box, with nothing but a concrete wall for company. But Umar isn't the only man who tried to destroy an American airliner. Another sits in ADX-2 with a crime that terrified the skies: the blind sheik's legacy. In the early 1990s, America faced a new kind of threat: radical jihad on its own soil. At the center was Omar Abdurrahman, known as the Blind Sheik. Though he died in 2017, his followers left a bloody trail. Among them was Ramzi Yousef, mastermind of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Yousef parked a Ryder van packed with explosives beneath the North Tower. His goal was to topple into the South Tower, killing tens of thousands. The plan failed, but 6 people died and more than 1,000 were injured. When Yousef was captured in 1995 in Pakistan, he was extradited to the U.S. and sentenced to multiple life terms. His punishment was clear: permanent isolation in ADX Florence. Here, Yousef is locked in solitary, unable to spread his ideas, unable to inspire attacks. Prison staff say his eyes burn with defiance even behind bars, but in Florence, defiance means nothing. His voice, once powerful enough to inspire mass murder, is now swallowed by concrete silence. But if Yousef's bomb shook New York, another man in ADX waged war from inside America itself: Rudolph, the Olympic Park bomber. The year was 1996. Atlanta, Georgia was celebrating the Summer Olympics. Crowds gathered at Centennial Olympic Park for concerts and festivities. But in the shadows, one man saw the event not as a celebration, but as a target. Eric Robert Rudolph planted a pipe bomb under a bench in park. When it exploded, 2 people were killed and over 100 injured. Rudolph wasn't finished. Over the next 2 years, he carried out more bombings at abortion clinics and a lesbian bar. For years, he vanished into the Appalachian wilderness, living in the mountains, eating berries, stealing supplies from gardens. He became a ghost, surviving longer than anyone thought possible. Finally, in 2003, police arrested him behind a grocery store dumpster in North Carolina. In 2005, Rudolph pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life without parole. Today, he is locked inside ADX Florence. Prison officials say he spends his time writing manifestos, but none of them leave the prison walls. The man who once hid in the mountains now lives where even the air is controlled, a cage inside the Rockies. And while Rudolph believed he was a soldier, ADX also houses men who once commanded entire cartels. The enforcer of Medellin, before El Chapo, before the Sinaloa cartel's rise. There was Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel, and one of Escobar's deadliest enforcers, Dandeny Munoz Mosquera, nicknamed La Quica. La Quica was a hitman like no other. Authorities believe he was responsible for hundreds of murders. His most infamous act came in 1989, when he helped bomb Avianca Flight 203 over Bogota, killing all 107 people on board. The target was a presidential candidate opposing Escobar. In 1991, La Quica was arrested in New York. By 1994, he was sentenced to life in prison for terrorism and murder. His final stop, ADX Florence. There, the man who once carried out massacres for Escobar sits powerless. Instead of coordinating hits or moving drugs, his life is now measured in chow hall trays and shackled walks to a recreation pen the size of a dog kennel. The enforcer of Medellin became another ghost swallowed by the walls of ADX. But some inmates weren't gangsters or terrorists. They were killers who shocked America with crimes so brutal they still haunt families today. Michael Swango, the Doctor of Death. Not all killers use guns or bombs. Some use syringes. Dr. Michael Swango was a trained physician, but behind his white coat was a predator. Investigators believe Swango killed as many as 60 patients by poisoning them with lethal drugs. Nurses grew suspicious when otherwise stable patients suddenly collapsed after his rounds. In 2000, Swango was sentenced to life without parole for murder and fraud. His medical career had turned into one of the deadliest in history. Today, Swango is housed at ADX Florence. His medical license is gone, his reputation destroyed. Instead of prescribing medicine, he swallows prison food under heavy watch. His cell is his new clinic, but there are no patients, only silence. The doctor who once pretended to heal now spends his days broken by concrete and time. And if Swango's crimes make you shiver, wait until you hear about the next inmate, a killer who fooled the entire country for decades. Larry Hoover, the gangster disciple. If you ask Chicago about the name Larry Hoover, you'll hear whispers of an empire built from inside prison walls. Hoover founded the Gangster Disciples, one of the most feared gangs in America. By the 1990s, the GDs had tens of thousands of members, spreading across multiple states, pulling in millions through drug trafficking, extortion, and violence. But here's the shocking part. Hoover kept control even while locked up. In the 1970s, he was already in prison for murder, yet his voice still carried across cities. His orders were passed like scripture, his word law on the streets. The FBI finally cracked down in 1995 with Operation Headache. Hoover was indicted for continuing to run the GDs like a CEO from behind bars. Convicted of drug conspiracy and criminal enterprise, he was given 6 life sentences. Today, Hoover sits inside ADX Florence. The man who once directed armies of gang members now spends 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a bathroom. The silence is deafening. Hoover's voice, once a thunderstorm in Chicago's neighborhoods, has been reduced to nothing but the echo of his own footsteps on concrete. Robert Hanssen, the spy who sold America. No chapter of betrayal cuts deeper than Robert Hanssen's. For over 2 decades, Hanssen worked as an FBI agent. By day, he wore a suit, shook hands, and protected America. But secretly, he was selling U.S. secrets to the Soviet Union and later Russia. From 1979 until his arrest in 2001, he handed over nuclear plans, counterintelligence strategies, and the identities of double agents. Many of those agents were executed. Because of him, the FBI called it the worst intelligence disaster in U.S. history. Hanssen lived a double life, quietly earning over $1.4 million in cash and diamonds from his Russian handlers, while his colleagues trusted him as one of their own. When he was finally caught in a Virginia park, placing a package of classified documents under a bridge, it was the end of the game. He pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to 15 life sentences. ADX Florence became his tomb of silence. Hanssen spent the rest of his life under the tightest restrictions, every word monitored, every movement controlled. He died in his cell in June 2023, but for decades he lived as the ultimate reminder. Even the guardians of secrets can become the greatest threats. Richard McNair, the escape artist. Most criminals fear prison. Richard McNair seemed to enjoy testing it. In 1987, McNair killed a man during a burglary in North Dakota. He was sentenced to life. But McNair wasn't the type to sit quietly in a cell. In fact, he became famous for his escapes. His first? Using lip balm to slip out of handcuffs. His second? Crawling through a ventilation duct. And his most audacious? In 2006, McNair sealed himself in a pallet of mail bags in a prison warehouse. Guards unknowingly shipped him right out the front gates. He was on the run for over a year before being recaptured. Authorities were humiliated. They needed a place where even McNair's clever tricks wouldn't work. That place was ADX Florence. Now, McNair lives in the one prison where escape is impossible. No mail bags, no ducts, no lip balm. Just steel doors, concrete walls, and a fortress that has never been broken. The man who once laughed at prison walls now faces the one he cannot beat. Thomas Silverstein, the most dangerous prisoner in America. Few names in prison history carry as much fear as Thomas Silverstein. Silverstein was a leader in the Aryan Brotherhood, a violent white supremacist gang inside U.S. prisons. In the 1980s, he murdered 3 inmates and a correctional officer named Merle Klutz at USP Marion. The murder of Klutz shook the entire prison system. After that, Silverstein was placed in what became known as no human contact status. For decades, he lived in solitary confinement. His cell was designed so he could not interact with anyone, not even see another prisoner. Guards placed food through slots. His only view of the world was a tiny slit of sky. When ADX Florence opened in 1994, Silverstein was one of its first inmates. The prison was practically designed for men like him, untouchable, uncontrollable, and untamable. He spent over 35 years in isolation before dying in 2019. To this day, his name is synonymous with why ADX exists, to hold men too dangerous for any other prison. Jose Padilla, the dirty bomb plot. After September 11th, the U.S. hunted not only those who carried out the attack, but anyone plotting the next one. One of the most chilling arrests came in 2002, when the FBI captured Jose Padilla, an American citizen accused of plotting to detonate a dirty bomb, a device combining radioactive material with conventional explosives. Padilla was held for years as an enemy combatant, interrogated under harsh conditions. His lawyers argued he had been brainwashed by extremist groups abroad. In 2007, he was convicted of conspiracy to commit terrorism and sentenced to 21 years, later extended to 17 more years after appeals. Padilla now resides in ADX Florence under strict watch. His days are silent, his communications monitored to ensure no extremist ideas ever escape his cell. Once seen as a threat capable of unleashing nuclear terror, he is now just another shadow in the endless hallways of Florence. Jamal Beghal, the radicalizer. In the early 2000s, Europe faced a new kind of terror network. At the center was Jamal Beghal, an Algerian-born extremist tied to al-Qaeda. Arrested in Dubai in 2001, he confessed to plotting an attack on the U.S. Embassy in Paris. Though some of his statements were later disputed, French authorities branded him one of the most dangerous recruiters in Europe. Beghal trained young men, who later became involved in terror plots across France and Belgium. His name resurfaced after the 2015 Paris attacks, as investigators revealed that two of the gunmen once considered him a mentor. When the U.S. requested custody on terrorism-related charges, Beghal was shipped to ADX Florence. There, he was placed under special administrative measures, cutting him off from potential followers. The man who once radicalized youth across continents now speaks only to concrete walls. His words, once poison, are now echoes that go nowhere. Syed Fahd Hashmi, the Manhattan conspirator. In 2006, a Pakistani-American student named Syed Fahd Hashmi was arrested in London and extradited to the U.S. on terrorism charges. The government accused him of allowing an acquaintance to store raincoats, ponchos, and waterproof socks in his apartment, items allegedly intended for al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. Though Hashmi himself was never accused of plotting attacks directly, his connection to material support charges was enough for prosecutors. In 2010, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Hashmi was sent to ADX Florence, where he was subjected to some of the harshest restrictions. For years, he was confined to a cell 23 hours a day, with limited access to mail, no group prayer, and only 1 hour of recreation in a cage. Supporters argue he was punished more for what he believed than what he did. But inside ADX, the debate doesn't matter. Hashmi's reality is silence, his punishment isolation. Omar Abdurrahman Jr., the silent heir. The blind sheik, Omar Abdurrahman, inspired terror plots across the world. While Abdurrahman died in 2017, some of his closest associates ended up in ADX Florence. Among them was his son, Omar Abdurrahman Jr., who carried his father's radical ideology forward. Though not as infamous as his father, Jr. became part of a network accused of spreading extremist literature and encouraging attacks. U.S. prosecutors tied him to overseas funding channels for terror groups. At ADX Florence, Jr. lives in near total silence. His name carries the weight of his father's, but his reach has been cut off completely. His words never leave the concrete tomb, and unlike his father, he has no audience left. Ahmed Ghailani, the embassy bomber. On August 7, 1998, two massive bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Over 200 people were killed and thousands injured. The attacks shocked the world, marking one of al-Qaeda's deadliest strikes before September 11th. One of the key operatives was Ahmed Ghailani. After years on the run, he was captured in Pakistan in 2004 and held in secret CIA prisons before being transferred to the U.S. for trial. In 2010, Ghailani was convicted of conspiring in the attacks and sentenced to life without parole. His new address, ADX Florence. Today, he is held under the strictest controls. No unsupervised calls. No uncensored mail. No chance to inspire future plots. The man who once helped orchestrate embassy bombings that shook continents is now just another name swallowed by the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber. It was a spring evening in New York City, May 1st, 2010. Times Square was alive with tourists and flashing billboards when smoke began pouring from a parked SUV. Inside was a car bomb, propane tanks, gasoline, fireworks, and fertilizer. The man who planted it, Faisal Shahzad, hoped to kill hundreds, but the bomb malfunctioned. Police evacuated the area and dismantled the device before it exploded. Shahzad, a Pakistani-American, was arrested 2 days later while trying to flee the country on a flight to Dubai. In court, he showed no remorse, declaring himself a soldier of Islam. He was sentenced to life without parole. ADX Florence became his forever cage. Now, the man who tried to turn New York's busiest street into a graveyard spends his life with no audience, no stage, no explosions, just endless silence. Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, Carlos the Jackal. Before al-Qaeda, before ISIS, one man was the face of international terrorism in the 1970s and 1980s. Carlos the Jackal, born Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, he became infamous for hijackings, bombings, and assassinations across Europe and the Middle East. His most notorious act came in 1975, when he led an armed raid on an OPEC meeting in Vienna, taking 60 hostages and killing 3 people. For decades, he was one of the most wanted men in the world, moving between safe houses, protected by allies. In 1994, he was finally captured in Sudan and handed over to France, where he received multiple life sentences. But in the U.S., his ties to international plots landed him in ADX Florence for part of his detention. The jackal, once feared across continents, was reduced to a number inside America's highest security prison. Anthony Battle, the prison killer. Not all of ADX's inmates come from the outside world. Some earn their place through violence inside prison walls. Anthony Battle was already serving life in prison when, in 1994, he brutally murdered a correctional officer at USP Atlanta. He ambushed the officer with a hammer, striking repeatedly in a shocking act of prison violence. The system had only one answer: ADX Florence. Battle was placed in solitary confinement, where he remains today. The man who couldn't be controlled inside a federal penitentiary now spends his life where control is absolute. Faisal Ali Abdurrahman, the global financier. While many ADX inmates are remembered for bombs and bloodshed, some of the money men who kept terror alive. Faisal Ali Abdurrahman, a Sudanese financier, was tied to al-Qaeda's funding networks in the 1990s. U.S. prosecutors accuse him of channeling millions through front companies to support bombings and training camps. Though less publicly known than bin Laden or Yousef, Abdurrahman was considered just as dangerous, not for pulling the trigger, but for making the bullets possible. His conviction earned him a life sentence in ADX Florence. The flow of money and influence stopped instantly. The man who once moved millions now measures wealth in plastic meal trays and prison library books. Frankie Breland, the gang enforcer. Street gangs are pipelines to federal prison. Few enforcers were as feared as Frankie Breland, a ruthless member of the Mexican mafia who left bodies across California in the 1990s. Breland's hits were so brazen that prosecutors labeled him a domestic terrorist operating in plain sight. Convicted of racketeering, drug trafficking, and multiple murders, Breland was sentenced to life without parole. His reward was transfer to ADX Florence. Today, the man who once enforced gang law with iron fists and bullets sits behind a door that never opens more than a few inches. In Florence, there are no gangs, no turf wars. Only silence. Silvestre Reyes, the cartel hitman. The final name on this list belongs to a man known only in whispers. Silvestre Reyes, a cartel hitman tied to dozens of murders across Mexico and the U.S. in the late 1990s. Reyes specialized in assassinations of rivals and law enforcement. Captured in Texas in 2002, he was extradited to face federal charges of racketeering and terrorism. His conviction earned him multiple life sentences. ADX Florence was his ultimate stop. The man who once killed without blinking now lives in a concrete cell with no power, no guns, no freedom. The enforcer became forgotten, and the silence of Florence swallowed him whole. The prison that swallows men whole. ADX Florence isn't just a prison. It's a tomb, a fortress built not to punish with violence, but with silence. Inside those concrete boxes, men who once shook the world are reduced to nothing. Drug lords who controlled armies of soldiers now shuffle in shackles. Terrorists who spread fear across continents now whisper to no one but themselves. Killers who once stalked the streets now measure life by the echo of their footsteps on cold steel. For 23 hours a day, they sit in a cell no larger than a bathroom. No human contact. No chaos. No power. Only white walls, steel doors, and a window so narrow it only shows a sliver of sky. Their only taste of freedom comes in a small outdoor pen, a cage inside a cage, open only to the clouds. El Chapo, the Boston Marathon bomber, the Olympic Park bomber, cartel hitmen, serial killers, spies, enforcers, men whose names once filled news headlines now exist in near total silence. The 30 most dangerous prisoners America has ever known, buried alive in the Rockies. And here's the truth. ADX Florence was never built just to contain these men. It was built to erase them, to strip away every ounce of control, every connection, every whisper of influence. Here, power dissolves into dust. Even the strongest minds break. Some pace endlessly. Some write letters that never leave. Others stop talking altogether, swallowed by the silence. One former warden called ADX a clean version of hell. And maybe that's the best way to describe it. No fire, no torture, just endless nothing. Because in ADX Florence, time is the real punishment. Days blur into years. Years blur into decades. And the men inside learn a final, brutal lesson. Backhand index pointing right, it doesn't matter how much fear you inspired, how much blood you spilled, or how many empires you built. In the end, silence devours everyone. And that's why ADX Florence will forever remain. The prison where the world's nightmares go to die.